is a pleasure to be here. They only gave me a half hour for my presentation today, but as you know, many of you know, I love English history. I have a Master of Arts in English medieval church history. So, like Henry VIII and his many wives, I shall not keep you very long. So, no company is an island. How a connected world creates new risk management challenges. You know, the English poet, I mentioned my fascination with English history. The English poet John Donne said, "No man is an island entire of himself. Every man is a piece of the continent, a part of the main." You replace those words man with organization, and it applies to the modern business world today. No organization is an island entire of itself, nor every organization is a piece of the continent, a part of the main. We're in an interconnected environment. The modern organization is not defined by brick and mortar walls and traditional employees. The modern organization is the extended enterprise. Outsourcers, service providers, vendors, suppliers, contractors, consultants, brokers, agents, dealers, intermediaries, temporary workers, partners, and more. You walk down the halls of many of your organizations, and half the people you walk by are not traditional employees. They are third parties. You sit in conference rooms, in company meetings, and several of the people that are there are third parties. One of our biggest challenges today is how do we manage risk across the extended enterprise, this interconnected world of business. The physicist Friedrich Capra stated, "The more we study the major problems of our time, the more we come to realize that they cannot be understood in isolation. They are systemic problems, which means that they are interconnected and interdependent." We've been hearing about this for the past 2 days, about connected risk, all these connections. And it impacts the organization significantly, not just within traditional brick and mortar walls, but across these extended third-party business relationships. This is one of the biggest challenges of our day, is managing risk and compliance across extended business. How do we do that? How do we go about that? You know, the physicist here on this slide was talking about biological ecosystems when he made this quote. But he might as well have been talking about risk in the modern extended enterprise of business. And these nested relationships, supply chain relationships, subcontracting relationships, and their risks are your risks, and you have to do something about it. Which brings us to the whole idea of chaos theory. The theory that I was just in the Netherlands last week in Amsterdam, but the theory of chaos theory is that the flutter of the butterfly's wings in the Netherlands makes tiny atmospheric changes that can influence the development path of a hurricane that'll hit here in Miami. Who knows? That next hurricane might have started in the Netherlands just with the flutter of a butterfly's wings. Those little things matter. Leonardo da Vinci stated, "Realize that everything connects to everything else." And we see this in the area of the extended enterprise and third-party risk. U.S. Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, UK Bribery Act, SEP and DO, that bribery and corruption world. Over 90% of U.S. Foreign Corrupt Practices Act enforcement actions involve third parties that are involved in the bribery scheme at some level. The complexity of those little things that matter. You go back 9 years ago to the Target breach, one of the largest breaches of data in history, credit card data, including 2 of my own. A HVAC vendor, a heating and air conditioning vendor, had a connection to the Target network for environmental monitoring. A hacker broke into the heating and air conditioning vendor, was able to jump across that network connection and compromise point of sale systems across Target, stealing millions of credit card numbers. Or a few years ago, the breach from a casino in which an Internet of Things device, and we've seen things like SolarWinds and all this stuff with backdoors and vulnerabilities. This all gets into the extended enterprise too. You know, an Internet of Things device in a fish tank was compromised, was the doorway in. Those little things matter. They might seem obscure down in the weeds, but they become big things if left unattended to. And the extended enterprise, this connected world we live in, makes this all the more complex. Look at the array of third-party risks. You got things like conduct risks with our vendor and supplier code of conduct at the high level. In some organizations, this is just a mess. I was reviewing one Fortune 100 company's supply chain code of conduct, and I couldn't believe what I was reading. It was, at the time, they've changed it. It was only published in English, and it was written in the passive voice and not the active voice. And so just how we're writing the supply chain code of conduct makes it hard for just even a regular English reader to read. But somebody has English as a second language, it's even harder to read. And the very first paragraph says company believes. The second paragraph says company strongly believes. had the word strongly in there. So we have different levels of belief in the supply chain code of conduct? I don't think so. But somebody like particularly a non-native English reader, somebody who has English as a second language, is going to see that word strongly in the second paragraph and think it's more important than the first paragraph, which is not what they're trying to get across. We have conduct risks, code of conduct, and that's significant. We have a huge focus on operational resilience and viability of our third parties. And you look at things like the United Kingdom's and FCA, PRA, Bank of England operational resilience guidance. Well, not guidance, regulation. It mentions vendor third-party risk about 35 times in the document. You look at EU's DORA, Digital Operational Resilience Act. It's filled with vendor third-party supplier risk in there. The US OCC guidance, the Basel Bank for National Settlements, Australia's CPS 230. To be a resilient organization, you have to address the extended enterprise, this connected world that we live in. You cannot be resilient without looking at your third-party relationships, those outsourcers and service providers and suppliers and vendors and more, because your business is dependent upon them. In order for your processes and business to be resilient, it requires that your third parties be resilient as well. And it's absolutely a huge challenge. I'm interacting with a very large global hospitality chain, and they're rebranding their risk department to include resilience because the organization, the line of business understands resilience in a way they don't understand risk. Risk is passed around like a hot potato and who wants to really own risk? But the line of business understands resilient. What business manager, what process owner doesn't want to have resilient processes and a resilient business? But this extends across these network of third-party relationships. You got privacy and information security risks, anti-bribery and corruption, like, as I mentioned, U.S. Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, UK Bribery Act, SEP and DO. You've got a range of ESG type things and environmental and social accountability, health and safety. Oh, the world is changing right now. I have put on more airline miles so far in 2023 than I have in any other entire year in my career. And I've been all over, from the Middle East to Riyadh and Dubai to Australia, across the US. I've been to London already 3 times this year. I got 3 more trips in the next month and a half to London. Amsterdam, I've been to Germany twice. That's just this year. But every one of those are talking about the extended enterprise, the third-party relationships, and ESG in these intersections. You got Germany's LKSG. I won't try to pronounce it in German. My German's horrible, and Germans love these very, very long words. And so I would not do German justice trying to pronounce it. But the LKSG, otherwise known as the German Corporation Supply Chain Due Diligence Act. So if you're a company that has 3,000 employees in Germany, right now you've got to be doing extensive ongoing due diligence around ESG across all layers of your supply chain and vendor relationships. January 1st next year, that goes down to 1,000 employees. I have talked to firms in Australia, the United States, in the United Kingdom, a global pharmaceutical firm, hospitality firm, food and beverage firm. Their number one third-party risk is Germany's LKSG law. Outside the US, these are outside Germany. These are all companies I talk to outside Germany that see their number one third-party risk is Germany's law. But not on now, just in the last couple of weeks, the EU Parliament has passed the EU CSDDD. We already have the EU CSRD, that's the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. That requires 50,000 firms to start ESG reporting. 50,000 firms have to start ESG reporting. But now they have the EU CSDDD, the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, which takes Germany's law and it requires every member country of Europe to pass a similar law to Germany's. So if you're doing business, if you have significant operations in Europe, it applies directly to you. But if you're in a German or soon to be any European country supply chain or vendor relationship, it hits you big time. We have a huge, huge thing coming around ESG and ongoing continuous due diligence in these third-party relationships. It has significant penalties and impacts. And so if you're anywhere in a supply chain vendor relationship of European countries, right now German countries, but we also have the Dutch Due Diligence Act and others. There's others too, but the Germany's the big one. You have to be addressing this. But then you have sanctions and import and export compliance and traceability of minerals. In fact, when I was in London a few weeks ago, I talked to a major global pharmaceutical firm, a major global hospitality firm, and a huge global food and beverage firm. Every one of those three said their number one risk in their third-party enterprise was Germany's law. And they're watching the EU one because it wasn't passed at the time. It was earlier in May. Their second number one risk, all three of those different industries, again, I mean, pharmaceutical, food and beverage, and hospitality, their second number one risk, PFAS, forever chemicals, in their supply chain, and dealing with that. And we have lawsuits all across the US. There's some in my state of Wisconsin right now on dealing with forever chemicals. And every one of them, their second number one risk was dealing with forever chemicals in their supply chain. Lots and lots of challenges, like traceability of minerals. We already have things like conflict minerals. We have to trace tin, tantalum, tungsten, and gold, 3TG, down to the source smelter and mine to determine if they come from the Democratic Republic of the Congo or 9 surrounding countries known for crimes against humanity. The burdens on third-party risk are legion. They're coming at us from all directions, and we have to do something about it. We have a tale of two futures. Charles Dickens, go back to that English theme of my favorite for loving English literature and history. But we have a tale of two cities, but we also have a tale of two futures. Is our future a Blade Runner future, or is it a Star Trek future? Are we headed towards that dystopia, that environmental and social disaster of Blade Runner? Or are we headed towards that future of Star Trek, where it's very environmentally green and socially cooperative and intergalactic cooperation among alien species and races and things? The future of Star Trek is very different from the future of Blade Runner. Which are we headed towards? The decisions not only governments make and individuals make, but businesses make and their web of third-party relationships make puts us on the path to one of these two futures. And the modern organization cannot be making ESG statements and reports without looking at the extended connected enterprise and addressing this. It's one of our biggest challenges. But addressing ESG and risk management across different cultures is quite challenging. Now, the E in ESG, the environment, it's not just about climate change. Climate change is a big portion of it, but it's PFAS and like the forever chemicals. It's air, water, waste, pollution. There's a lot that goes into the E in ESG. Now, we're trying to figure a lot of that out. We haven't figured it out. We need to be good stewards of our world and our environment. And I don't think anybody, even though we might have different, faith or different types of backgrounds here, well, I think every one of us would agree that we need to be good stewards of our world. Now, the E we're still trying to figure out. Nobody's locked it down and figured out how are we going to address this. We're all sort of in the same boat. Now, flip over to the G, and we've got the most mature aspect of ESG, where the G deals with things like anti-bribery and corruption and information security and internal controls of financial reporting, tax transparency, beneficial ownership, all those elements. The S, that's the most tricky one. It's extremely tricky. How do we address this culturally around the world? What is put forth as values in North America and Europe aren't necessarily the same values shared in parts of the Middle East and Asia and Africa. How do we as global businesses address the S consistently across our enterprise? We deal with things like inclusivity and diversity and things like that. It's an extremely big challenge. But we're seeing this play out in the United States. And I'm not taking a position on one side or the other, but you objectively look at it and you come to think, is Target and Anheuser-Busch getting ahead of themselves right now? Billions of dollars in lost revenue. Billions. All because of that S in ESG. So how do we go about approaching this, and what's the right balance in things to address this? Because you get too far in front of it in some areas, and it can end up biting you back. It's a very complicated area. And again, I'm not trying to take sides and positions on that. I'm saying if you objectively look at it and what's happening, it is a very tricky and a very risky area to navigate right now. We have to manage risk across the extended enterprise, from our supply chains, our vendors, our third party relationships, and all the nuances of this. And it is quite challenging. And we need to be able to manage the life cycle of these risks because the extended enterprise is our business. Everyone, myself, I'm a company of one person, myself, but I've got contractors and people that help me deliver stuff for web services, for editing, for other marketing aspects and things, even some writing and things that sometimes I contract out. And so there's elements of all this that we depend upon others. Our business is dependent upon others. So we need to be able to manage risk, not just through the onboarding process when we engage a third party, but also through the ongoing life cycle, that continuous monitoring of the relationship, and to the offboarding. Now, a lot of organizations have steps set up for the onboarding. Things start to fall apart in the ongoing monitoring, but there's maturity happening there. But so many organizations I talk to completely fail on the offboarding. How do you say goodbye to a third party and close the books on that third party properly? So we need to be able to see the tree as well as the forest. That individual third party risk and relationship in our connected enterprise to the forest of risks across the business and across our suppliers and geographies. Now, I teach my third party risks workshops around the world. In April, I did it in Chicago, New York, San Francisco, and Houston. But you go back to February of 2020, the month before lockdowns for COVID. And I taught my third-party risk workshops in, again, New York, San Francisco, Dallas, not Houston, and London. And it was interesting. I presented this slide. In the San Francisco workshop, I actually think that was hosted by MetricStream, if I remember right. But there was a bank there that said, great analogy, the trees and the forest, I get it. But the reality in our environment, it's also the leaves and the branches. We only have to not only see the tree and the forest, we have to get down to the details that make up that tree. And for their case, they said, we outsourced 4 data centers to Oracle. And 3 of those house EU citizen information that has to comply with GDPR. 1 doesn't. So there's different types of risks on each data center that we outsource to the same relationship. In another example, a week later, I did the same workshop in London, and one of the global banks was there and said the exact same thing. They didn't talk to each other, said, great analogy, the tree and the forest, but in our business, it gets down to the leaves and the branches. But they use the example that we might have an outsourcing relationship with Wipro, Tata, Accenture, whatever it is. We might have 100 contracts and service level agreements. Each one has their own risks that we have to manage to. So we have to manage risk at that, not just the relationship level, but each of those contracts and service levels. I was on the Social Accountability Advisory Board for a major Fortune company, dealing with child labor, forced labor, working hours, wage and hour, international labor standards across a global supply chain of 5,000 suppliers with 20,000 facilities. And they actually manage risk not just at the relationship level of each of the 5,000 suppliers, but at the facility level. One supplier might have 1 facility, another supplier might have 10 facilities. But they manage and measure risk around each facility level for child labor, forced labor, working hours, wage and hour. All those were critical. It's the leaves and the branches as well, as these are connected relationships. And you look at Germany's law and now the EU CSDDD, and it's not just the facilities and things within a relationship, but it's the nest below it. We got to do due diligence somehow on layers of supply chain relationships, layers of subcontracting relationships. This is a huge, huge challenge with a lot of potential liability coming for organizations. In fact, I'll get to that in a second, but ESG is about the integrity of the organization. And so that is one big trend we're seeing in this connected enterprise, is the integrity that, and we're seeing a lot of laws and regulations dealing with, how do we manage ESG, just not internally, but across these extended business relationships. But this gets down to that ability for trust and integrity being critical. Businesses must act in good faith towards customers, employees, stakeholders, communities, and their third-party partners as well in this. We're building an era of trust. And this is defined in the core values that often get codified in your code of conduct, but then in your supplier vendor code of conduct as well. And dealing with the ethics, respect, integrity, and honesty of the organization throughout the connected enterprise, including the traditional brick and mortar business and employees, but across these extended web of third party relationships. This requires that we have ongoing due diligence, not just initial due diligence during onboarding, but continuous ongoing monitoring and due diligence, where you can take technology like MetricStream and do your initial due diligence, your ongoing assessments and questionnaires, but it can plug into third-party data sources out there that can gather politically exposed persons, watch lists, sanction lists, geopolitical risk information, negative news, ESG ratings, cybersecurity ratings, and be able to triangulate all this complex information so that we get real-time visibility into it. Businesses must take reasonable steps to ensure they manage risks and maintain ethical environments and third-party relationships across the extended relationship. But it also requires that organizations are looking for agility. Agility is how do we navigate our business? We have objectives we're trying to achieve, but the world is a very volatile world out there. Things are changing. And we have disruptions at all sorts of levels. I mean, COVID-19, the war in Ukraine, inflation. My wife at Easter time went and scoured all of Milwaukee looking for jelly beans. Now, and so this is a way I can explain to my wife what I do and things like that and the outcome of this. But she couldn't find jelly beans. Why was she getting jelly beans? Well, we have 3 adult children, 3 sons. They're all in their 20s. One's about to turn 30. They still get Easter candy. So jelly beans is a tradition. But she couldn't find jelly beans anywhere. Why? The war in Ukraine. The wheat production in Ukraine impacted the starch that's available for jelly beans, causing a jelly bean shortage in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, which my wife couldn't deliver jelly beans for our sons in our annual Easter tradition. It's this interconnected world. We need the agility to see risks and how they play out. How can inflation and supply chain risks and economic uncertainty and interest rates and regulatory developments and enforcement actions, is this not only hitting me now, but what's projected 6 months to 12 months from now? And how can that play out in scenarios in the organization so we can be agile and not just resilient? But resilience is important too. If I'm running down the streets here in Miami, and I don't know if anybody's walked out here in Miami, but drivers are crazy here in Miami. Now, I know many of you on the MetricStream side are from India, and I understand driving in India is a whole nother level of insane. But gosh, I mean, Miami drivers, it's like, I'm scared to walk across the street at a crosswalk. But if I'm running down the street in Miami and I trip over something, resilience is how quickly can I get back up and start running again. While agility is the ability to see the environment and navigate it and not trip over an obstacle. Or if I did, minimize that impact. Organizations need to be agile and resilient. It's absolutely critical. They both go hand in hand. They work with each other. But in the extended enterprise, this connected risk of everything that we're looking at in business, we need the ability to be agile and resilient together. It's absolutely critical. But we're also seeing a greater focus on accountability too. And we see this, and I've been saying this for years. I remember talking about it to MetricStream and having dinner with French Caldwell when he was here, and he just passed away, and our condolences to his family. But I remember having dinner with the French before the MetricStream Summit, 7 years ago, I think it was. But I was saying, what are you doing about UKSMCR? And during that summit, Barclays said their number one focus is UKSMCR and talking to the clients. But the senior managers and certification regime in the United Kingdom, it requires you to define 28 senior management functions that are ultimately accountable for risk and compliance and control. And if there is willful misconduct, that senior manager can go to jail. If there is negligence or lack of due diligence, that senior manager can be fined out of their bank account. And I've told companies, just wait. The regulations come out, people push them, but then it's a couple of years later that enforcement starts happening. Barclays' former CEO was fined £640,000 for a whistleblower infraction that he had to pay out of his bank account, not Barclays' bank account. Now, just a few months ago in April, a chief information officer was fined originally £100,000. It was negotiated down to £80,000, but you calculate interest rate exchange, so about 100,000 US dollars for a third-party risk issue. A CIO of a bank in England was fined 100,000 US dollars, 80,000 pounds, for a third-party risk failure. It's getting real. And then you have accountability regimes around the world that modeled it after the UK. Ireland's SEER, Australia's Bear Now Fear, Hong Kong's Managers in Charge, Singapore's Individual Accountability and Conduct. South Africa has one that they passed last year. In the US, we don't have that, but we have a great focus on accountability. You look at the US Department of Justice, the evaluation and compliance programs is putting more and more focus on senior executives. You look at the US Sentencing Commission, organizational sentencing guidelines, huge focus on prosecuting and senior executives for compliance failures. You see stuff in New York State and California on greater accountability. And of course, Uber's former chief information security officer was held personally accountable for a security breach. There's a lot going on accountability right now as well. And it impacts the third-party risk area. Just talk to that, CIO over in England. So we need greater visibility into a lot of context and to be able to triangulate information and be able to see across these, to take in geopolitical risk information, regulatory information, industry practices and environmental standards and all this, and as well as the internal context of our relationships and our standards, our controls, our policies, to be able to take in a lot of that information. And if you're trying to do this in documents, spreadsheets, and emails, it's what I call the inevitability of failure. You just can't do this. You're going to constantly be behind the game. One organization I interviewed was stated that they were spending 200 hours to build a report on risk events for the board of directors every year. 200 hours to build one report every year on risk events. The last year they did that, they found out they had risk issues that started 11 months ago that had grown out of control. They now leverage software to build those reports that's there at a push of a button. Not only that, they get real-time dashboards and visibility anytime they want into it. I worked on an RFP for a mid-sized bank. They did an internal study of their risk, compliance, audit, security resources and found that 80% of their staff time is actually spent managing and chasing documents and emails and not actually managing risk. And they want to turn that around. But document spreadsheets and emails for risk, compliance, control purposes, third-party risk purposes, it is the inevitability of failure. You're going to get caught off guard, and they don't provide a strong evidence trail of what is happening in the organization. So we need good technology that can take in a lot of distributed and disconnected data points. Things like we learned about with MetricStream's new Aspire and things, to be able to even leverage artificial intelligence. I'm talking to organizations around the world on not only how do we leverage AI for GRC, what I call cognitive GRC, but how do we have AI GRC, the governance, risk, and compliance of artificial intelligence itself? But there's some areas where we need to be cautious, but there's still value. Like ChatGPT. Now, generative AI, I love. There's good things for it. I went out testing ChatGPT several months ago, and I said, write my wife a love poem. And it came out with this beautiful love poem. I texted to my wife, and I got all these little starry emojis back, and you wrote that for me? And I paused for a second and said, no, ChatGPT did, but I told it to. But, so there's good things. But I spoke on a webinar last month on consumer duty, the United Kingdom's consumer duty law. I'm sorry if I say so much about the UK, but I'm over there all the time. I'm in London next week, home for a week, London for a week, home for a week, then London for a week. There's so much going on over there. But the UK consumer duty law, I asked I built all my slides already, but I thought, let's see what ChatGPT comes up with it. Tell me about UK's consumer duty. It got some good things and actually said, oh, I'll tweak my presentation and add that verbiage there and here. But it also got things wrong, including some of the due dates are sort of flip-flop backwards and things. It's like, in the hands of a subject matter expert, ChatGPT can be useful and powerful. But in the hands of somebody that is lazy, it can be dangerous. And somebody that's not a subject matter expert, it can be very dangerous because you need to validate the outcome. It might be able to produce a lot of good information in detail, but you've got to edit it and make sure it's accurate. Furthermore, other areas of cognitive GRC, like natural language processing, I see a lot of benefit. I'm seeing a lot on regulatory change. I was talking to, you print off the United Kingdom's FCA rulebook, and it's a stack of paper 6 feet tall. In fact, in another illustration, it's sort of off topic, but I'm interacting with a global European bank on policy management. And they said, if you print off every policy booklet at each of our branches, it'll be as tall as Big Ben. But that's a side thing. But it's UK FCA rulebook, 6 feet tall. You print off the US Code of Federal Regulations and stack it end to end. Last I checked, it was longer than a marathon, and over like 27, 28 miles. And so that's a lot. Now, if I'm going to read that much regulation, my mind's going to wander. I'm going to think, well, are the Milwaukee Bucks going to be making the right decision about the next the next coach that we're hiring? What are we doing for vacation this summer? Can I even do a vacation with all my travel? Or should I add that vacation on? I mean, our minds wander. A machine stays on task. A machine can take that 6 feet of paper, and I've seen demos of it, and read it, but not only read it, dissect it and map it in a matter of like 10 minutes. What would take me a gazillion hours to read, and let alone try to map and things, much more on top of that. But I was talking to a chief ethics and compliance officer at a life science organization. They found natural language processing to be 30% more accurate than humans because the machine stays on task. It's not thinking about the Milwaukee Bucks or vacation or dinner plans. And so they found that the machine was 30% more accurate in that mapping. But we need to be able to take things in and understand these distributed, disconnected data points, integrate, map them together, understand them contextually, and build out action items. So 10 things to think about on achieving in this connected world of risk. Approaching this with a strong GRC strategy, process, and technology should enable us to achieve our business objectives, whether they're entity, division, department, process, project, asset, or even like relationship objectives in a third-party relationship. That's a whole nother soapbox I can get on. People talk about ESG risks. That's putting before the cart before the horse. It starts with ESG objectives. We have an objective to be carbon neutral. Only then can we understand risks in this context. Solutions and others are leading with ESG risk management. To me, are backwards thinking, where it should be ESG objectives. But anyways, we can reliably achieve our objectives, ensure risk-aware setting of objectives and strategic planning, develop, enhance, define, and guide our culture, increase stakeholder confidence while preparing and protecting the organization while preventing, detecting, and reducing adversity and weakness. We can motivate and inspire desired conduct, stay ahead of the game, improve responsiveness and efficiency, and optimize economic return and value. So in wrapping this up, since I'm a couple minutes over, I'm sorry, Patricia. But if we approach this, we should become more aware. We should build 360-degree contextual awareness so we become more aware of risks and their interconnectedness, not only within traditional brick and mortar walls, but across the extended enterprise. We can become aligned to work together, be more responsive to changes and develops through mergers and acquisitions, geopolitical risks, or whatever might happen, to be agile to navigate those environments. But when we do have events, to be resilient and recover from them, and leveraging technology like our host MetricStream, we can do it in a way that is efficient in our use of human capital, that's time, and financial capital, which is money. So with that, I can turn this back over to you.